Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Sechrist. I'm a second-year PhD student in interdisciplinary studies at the University of British Columbia. My doctoral program combines literature, creative writing, and mathematics. Specifically, I'm studying how authors use mathematical metaphor and figures in fiction.
And my name is Rachel Horst. I'm in the Language and Literacy Education Department at UBC. I'm also a second year PhD student. I'm interested in critical digital literacies, arts-based research, and narrative inquiry. And I'm specifically interested in how our narratives and stories enact possibility and shape our futures, and how we can take up storying as a generative practice.
So both Rachel and I were interested in using a mathematical equation or figure as the inspiration for our collaborative fiction project. The lemniscate of Bernoulli proved quite fruitful. The lemniscate is a familiar figure reminiscent of the symbol for infinity. This beautiful sinuous curve is the inverse or pedal curve of a rectangular hyperbola, a special type of conic section, which features reflected twin curves that are limited by asymptotes that are perpendicular to each other. The mathematical hyperbola has a literary twin, the rhetorical hyperbole. Both share an etymological Greek root meaning excessive or overthrown. Higher level hyperbolic geometry studies this excess of surface, illustrated beautifully by mathematician and fiber artist Dana Taimina. Taimina, a math professor at Cornell University, started a revolution in mathematical modeling by using hyperbolic crochet samples to show viscerally what happens in hyperbolic space. By increasing the crochet stitches at the perimeter, a simple circle begins to crenellate and fold back on itself. These material textile objects, called pseudospheres, are lushly organic and gloriously tactile. They are beautiful models analogous of not just the mathematical concept of negative curvature, which defines hyperbolic space, but also many natural phenomena, from the leaves of curly kale to the growth of coral reefs. We wanted to experiment with the hyperbolic imbued in both the lemniscate and the pseudosphere, in both the inverse and the excessive. We each wrote a story and gave it to the other to handle like a crafted material object, to learn the intricacy and pattern of its stitches, so we could collaboratively reinterpret those intersections, gaps, and curvature into a new story.
In my work, I'm interested in exploring how stories shape the world and our various futures, and how they enact possibility. So I wanted to take up the lemniscate and bring it into the materiality of my life through fiction. I began with the house, this house, which is the house that I had recently moved into, and I set this as the origin and access point of the imagined grid upon which the pedal curves of the narrative would blossom. In the real world, my family and I were sharing that rented house with a friend and her two children, and I have two children as well. This was an experiment in communal living that began around the time that Susan and I first started playing with the idea of engaging in a collaborative writing inquiry together. The idea and my living circumstances and the story that started to emerge all began to feel very connected. Whenever Susan and I got together, we would first give each other updates about our lives, and these conversations would blend into conversations of the stories emerging. And during this time, the pandemic, took hold of the globe, and the city became shut down. And that felt like a fiction overtaking reality in some sense. I was locked down within the geography of the house as well as the story, and also within this symmetry of the lemniscate. As Elizabeth St. Pierre argues, writing is also an empirical field of inquiry. And through the writing and fictioning of my own life circumstances, diffracted through fiction along the rhythmic shapes of the lemniscate, I was able to become with this moment in history.
So my story, Fantasy Forward, features a protagonist who is a maladaptive daydreamer. a person who spends an inordinate and sometimes obsessive amount of time engaged in fantastical thinking. Like Rachel, I was picturing this lemniscate and these curves and trying to map a narrative onto this shape. I wanted to write about how fantasy can be the reflective reverse of reality, like those twin hyperbolic curves, back to back and never intersecting. But the relationship between fantasy and reality can also be like the lemniscate, deeply connective, productive, creative, and generative.
To extend Susan's wonderful metaphor of the hyperbolic crochet, I'm bringing up Donna Haraway, who's sort of one of the luminaries of my thinking. And she uses SF as this sign or figure for science fiction, speculative feminism, science fantasy, speculative fabulation, science fact, and also string figures. This is the collaborative play with strings. She continues, playing games of string figures is about giving and receiving patterns, dropping threads and failing, but sometimes finding something that works, something consequential and maybe even beautiful that wasn't there before. This is the collaborative crochet. It's and game of people taking up that thread of the narrative and creating these figures or shapes. Using a variety of different tools online, we played with these shapes. This one here, I was able to actually draw out the words of Susan's excellent story and draw along the strings of Donna Haraway's idea as painted by ballet. And here we have this sort of interconnection of ideas, metaphors, and materialities that we're playing with in this methodology.
So with Rachel's wonderful story, I took a very simple data-driven approach at first. I selected 1 or 2 paragraphs at a time and processed the text using the Sechrist module in Voyant tools. And that created a series of graphical representations of related frequency of words. I used these graphical images as inspiration to restory Rachel's text. Each predominant word became like a tangent on the curve, and each tangent served as a way to change the initial conditions of Rachel's complex story, revealing new emergent properties that already existed within the text. In particular, her material language provided me with physical handholds, permitting me to create divergent and experimental paragraphs, interpretations, but that still maintained a level of topological coherence with her original story. So after each of us took a pass at hyperbolizing our original stories, I created another framework for recombining and restoring those texts. I used the Sechrist tool again with each first derivative to identify word frequencies. From these graphics, side by side, I identified categories that connected the first 2 derivative stories with shared concepts, emotions, objects, and then arbitrarily organized them into a categorized numbered list of elements. Using a random number generator, I selected 5 discrete and distinct word elements that each story shared: memory, children, city, little, and eyes. I then searched each first derivative story for the first instance of the word element and selected that sentence. This set became a second derivative and the seeds for a microfiction that would combine both stories into a third derivative, further refined by my own authorial choices. The resulting intertwined microfiction is surprisingly cogent and compelling and features some intriguing social and material points of intersection. What I found most interesting was how readily the content at this stage of manipulation and interpretation actually fits together. It seems richer, more ripe and fertile, and more malleable, and yet it's dense with very particular and definitive meaning.
I took up a different but related methodology when I entered into Susan's amazing story. I read it just as a story, like how we're taught to read words for representations and as a whole. But then I wanted to enter into the story as an apparatus or as an architecture. Broad uses the term apparatus in this way. She says they're material reconfigurings of the world that do not merely engage in time, but iteratively reconfigure space-time matter as part of the ongoing dynamism of becoming. And in this way, I think that Susan's story works in that, and in that apparatus way. So I entered into that space and sought out the material contingencies that shaped the flow of events. I created an interactive fiction to help me see how our stories fit together. And so if we enter in through Susan's story, here you see I snagged even on that first line, a woman fainted on the bus. And there has these contingencies in there that I allowed myself to diffract and open up possibilities. A woman fainted on the bus. A woman died on the bus. A woman was taken from the bus. A woman fractalated on the bus. A woman fell on the bus. And in this way, I was opening up this space in her story while still tethered to the materiality of the woman and the bus. One particular instance in the story that was really exciting, or not in the story, but in the methodology, was when I took up one of Susan's diffractions and one of mine and just simply connected them like a weaving, her line for my line for her line. And there were moments of total chaos and nonsense, but then there were these other moments when it came together in this very meaningful, surprising, and unusual way. So we're just going to read to you a little bit from this piece here. Bus driver, someone yelled, and the bus stopped.
I reached for my phone and yelled out. Her young face is yellow-gray, her eyelids unbuoyant. A rushing doubt simultaneously sounded with impossible satisfaction.
I feel hot and tingly, she said. Alexis screamed, her skin a conviction obscured by the doorway.
You are alone and afraid, I said, beneath her husband.
I feel tingly and alone and afraid, she said. Obviousness, attentiveness. You are drunk and afraid, I said, the face of her child.
I feel drunk and passionate, you said, far from happy, a presence to decipher.
I feel the weight. I feel the future like the weight of the past, she said. You
are unusual, I said. So this was a very unusual, surprising experience. Things emerged that I think we didn't expect, which was wonderful. Developing this methodology was a bit of a freewheeling adventure. For me, as a writer, I see this hyperbolizing methodology as a new way to workshop creative writing beyond the normal critique. We found this wasn't so much a collaboration of authors, but really a way to change the initial conditions of the text to arrive at new emergent characteristics and properties. And then second, as a curious amateur interested in mathematics, I see this kind of restoring as a way to invite others to play with difficult mathematical and scientific concepts, maybe with all kinds of difficult concepts. To get our minds and hands on them, to make them real in surprising and unusual ways, just as Dinah Taimina has done with her hyperbolic crochet, to become smitten with them and enchanted by their potential.
Mm-hmm. I love that, smitten. It's also a way of breathing space and possibility into an idea, and making our own ideas strange to ourselves so that we can encounter them anew. I think it's a process of intentional entanglement with other minds as well as technologies, and inviting that unexpected or unusual to emerge. I think when we when we author a story, when we come up with a solution to a problem, or when we name the world in some particular way, we feel a sense of authorship and ownership and finality about that solution or draft or definition. And I think this methodology is a way of giving up that ownership and engaging in creative, generative, and socio-material collaborations that are not just pure make-believe, but rather are tethered to the material world in a mutually impactful way. Thank you very much for listening to our talk. These are some of the digital tools we used, and these are our references.
Thank you.